In this episode, we move into one of the most practical and visible parts of protecting information assets, because access control shapes who gets in, what they can reach, and what they are allowed to do once they are there. For a brand new learner, this topic matters because many security failures do not begin with advanced attacks or complex system flaws. They begin when the wrong person receives access, the right person receives too much access, or access stays active long after the business need has ended. Access control methods give organizations ways to decide how permissions are assigned and enforced, while evaluation helps determine whether those methods are actually working in a trustworthy way. Once you understand that access control is really about making deliberate decisions around trust, privilege, and accountability, the subject becomes much easier to follow because it stops looking like a random list of permissions and starts looking like one coordinated effort to protect important information, systems, and business processes from misuse, error, and unnecessary exposure. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good place to begin is with the basic meaning of access control itself. Access control is the set of policies, processes, and technical mechanisms used to decide whether a person, system, or device can interact with an information asset, and, if so, what kind of interaction is permitted. That interaction may involve viewing a file, editing a database record, approving a transaction, entering a restricted room, using an application, or administering a server. This means access control is not simply a login screen or a password requirement. It is the larger discipline of deciding who can do what, under which conditions, and for how long. For a beginner, one of the most helpful ways to think about access control is as a gatekeeping system tied directly to business need. The organization is trying to make sure that legitimate work can happen efficiently while also reducing the chance that people or systems will see, change, delete, or misuse information they should not be able to reach. Access control matters because information assets do not all carry the same sensitivity, and not every user needs the same level of authority. A payroll administrator, a customer service representative, a software developer, and a building maintenance contractor may all work for the same organization, yet their need for access should be very different. If the organization fails to control those differences carefully, confidentiality may be lost when sensitive records are exposed, integrity may suffer when unauthorized changes occur, and availability may be affected when critical systems are altered or disrupted. This is why access control is closely tied to the broader security goals of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA. It is also why access decisions should always connect back to business purpose rather than convenience alone. For a learner, the important lesson is that access is powerful. Giving someone access is not a neutral administrative action. It is a trust decision that can either support safe operations or quietly create the conditions for serious harm if handled carelessly. Several guiding principles make access control more effective, and among the most important is least privilege. Least privilege means users should receive only the minimum access required to perform legitimate job responsibilities and no more. This matters because every extra permission creates extra opportunity for misuse, error, accidental exposure, or damage if the account is compromised. Closely related is the idea of need to know, which means access to sensitive information should be limited to those whose roles genuinely require it. Another important principle is separation of duties, where critical tasks are divided so that one person cannot control every part of a sensitive process without oversight. These principles help organizations avoid the common trap of granting broad access simply because it is easier in the short term. For a beginner, these ideas are useful because they show that strong access control is not about making work difficult. It is about making permissions deliberate, limited, and aligned with actual responsibility so the organization reduces risk without blocking legitimate business activity. To understand access control clearly, it also helps to separate identity, authentication, and authorization, because those ideas work together but do not mean the same thing. Identity is the recognized representation of a person, device, or system in the environment. Authentication is the process of verifying that the entity requesting access is really that identity, often through passwords, tokens, or biometric checks. Authorization comes after successful authentication and determines what the identity is allowed to do. This distinction matters because a user may prove who they are and still not be entitled to view certain data or change certain settings. In practical terms, access control depends on this sequence working properly. If identity is weak, authentication becomes unreliable, and if authorization is careless, even correctly authenticated users may receive permissions that are too broad. For beginners, this explains why access control is more than a technical setting. It is the controlled relationship between knowing who the requester is, confirming that claim, and then limiting their actions to what the organization has approved. One major part of access control involves how access is granted, changed, and removed as business needs evolve. A strong organization does not let people collect permissions informally over time without review. Instead, access should be requested, approved by the right authority, assigned based on role or documented need, and revisited whenever employment status, job function, or project assignment changes. This lifecycle approach matters because excessive access often appears gradually, as users move between teams, take on temporary work, or retain permissions from past responsibilities that no longer apply. When access is not removed promptly, the organization accumulates stale privileges that no longer reflect reality. That creates risk even if the users themselves are trustworthy, because old rights can still be misused, exploited, or activated accidentally. For a beginner, this is one of the clearest lessons in evaluation. Access control should be judged not only by how permissions are created, but also by how well the organization keeps those permissions current, justified, and consistent with what people actually need today. Different access control methods help organizations decide how permissions are structured, and one of the classic models is discretionary access control, DAC. In DAC, the owner or creator of an object, such as a file or resource, has the ability to decide who else can access it and what kind of access they will receive. This method offers flexibility, which can be useful in environments where people need to share information quickly and directly. At the same time, that flexibility can become a weakness if users make poor decisions, grant access too broadly, or fail to understand the sensitivity of what they control. DAC works best when users are informed and when the environment can tolerate some local control over sharing decisions. For a beginner, the important takeaway is that DAC places more decision-making power closer to the user, which may improve convenience, but can also create inconsistency. That trade-off is exactly the kind of thing organizations and auditors have to consider when evaluating whether an access control method fits the sensitivity and risk profile of the assets involved. Another model is mandatory access control, MAC, which is much more centrally controlled and less flexible at the individual user level. In MAC, access decisions are based on defined classifications and labels, and users cannot casually change permissions on their own. A resource may be marked at a certain sensitivity level, and users may be cleared only for information at or below a specific level according to organizational rules. This makes MAC especially useful where strong control, formal classification, and strict separation are necessary. The benefit is that individual preference has far less influence over access decisions, which can reduce accidental sharing and inconsistent permission assignment. The drawback is that MAC can be rigid and harder to manage in environments where business needs change rapidly or where collaboration requires frequent adjustment. For a beginner, MAC is important because it shows the other end of the control spectrum. Instead of letting users largely decide, the organization enforces access through centrally defined rules that reflect sensitivity and organizational authority. A very common method in modern organizations is role-based access control, RBAC, which assigns permissions according to job roles rather than individually building access from scratch for every user. The basic idea is that people who perform similar work usually need similar access, so the organization can group permissions into roles and assign users to those roles based on their responsibilities. This creates more consistency and often makes administration easier, because managers and support teams can think in terms of business function rather than separate permission lists for each employee. RBAC also supports evaluation well, because reviewers can look at whether the role itself still makes sense and whether users belong in the roles they have been assigned. However, RBAC is not automatically strong simply because it sounds organized. If roles become bloated with unnecessary permissions or are poorly designed, the model can still produce excessive access. For a beginner, the main point is that RBAC works well when roles are realistic, limited, and maintained carefully over time. Another increasingly important method is attribute-based access control, ABAC, which makes access decisions based on combinations of attributes rather than only on role or ownership. Attributes may relate to the user, the resource, the device, the location, the time of day, or other contextual factors that influence whether access should be allowed. For example, a user may have the correct role to view a resource, but access might still be denied if the request comes from an unmanaged device or from a location that the organization treats as higher risk. ABAC can support very precise decisions in environments where context matters as much as identity. The strength of this method is flexibility and granularity, but the challenge is that it can become complex if policies are not clearly designed and maintained. For a beginner, ABAC is valuable because it shows that access control is evolving beyond simple yes or no decisions tied only to a person's job title. In many environments, access now depends on a richer set of conditions that shape trust at the moment of the request. Organizations also rely on technical enforcement mechanisms to carry these methods into daily operation. Permissions, groups, session controls, directory services, and access control lists, ACL, all help translate policy decisions into actual system behavior. An ACL, for example, can specify which identities or groups may read, write, execute, or otherwise interact with a resource, while group membership can make permission assignment more manageable across large numbers of users. Authentication controls also strengthen access decisions, and multi-factor authentication, MFA, is especially important because it reduces the risk that a stolen password alone will be enough to gain entry. These technical elements are not separate from access control methods. They are the practical tools that help enforce them. For a beginner, the key point is that access control is both conceptual and operational. The model explains how the organization wants decisions to work, and the technical mechanisms make sure those decisions are applied consistently when real users and systems attempt to interact with real assets. Evaluation becomes essential because access control can look strong in a policy document while remaining weak in actual practice. A proper evaluation asks whether the chosen method fits the organization's business needs, whether permissions reflect real job responsibilities, whether access is approved and removed appropriately, and whether the control environment reduces unnecessary privilege rather than quietly expanding it. Evaluators also consider whether the access model supports accountability, meaning the organization can tell who did what and whether that activity was authorized. Another important question is whether the access control design aligns with the sensitivity of the assets involved. A casual sharing model may be acceptable for low-risk information, but completely inappropriate for highly regulated or highly confidential data. For a beginner, evaluation means more than checking if users can log in. It means looking at design, consistency, appropriateness, and control discipline to determine whether access management is truly supporting the protection of information assets rather than just creating the appearance of order. In practice, evaluating access control often involves reviewing access requests, approvals, user entitlements, group memberships, privileged accounts, termination handling, and periodic recertification activities. It may also include examining whether access reviews are meaningful or merely routine sign-offs that nobody studies carefully. Logs and monitoring can help show whether users are operating within expected patterns or whether unusual access behavior suggests misuse, excessive privilege, or control gaps. Evaluators also pay close attention to exceptions, because exceptions are often where the real weakness appears. A control model may seem strong until reviewers discover that emergency access, shared accounts, third-party access, or long-standing special approvals have gradually weakened the intended safeguards. For a beginner, This is an important way to think about evaluation. Strong access control is not proven only by its normal path. It is also proven by how well the organization governs the unusual situations where pressure, convenience, or special requests might otherwise create shortcuts that undermine the rest of the control structure. There are several common weaknesses that students should recognize because they appear repeatedly in real organizations. One is privilege creep, where users slowly accumulate more access than they need because old permissions are never removed when roles change. Another is poor control over privileged accounts, since administrators or service accounts can create outsized risk if their access is too broad or insufficiently monitored. Shared accounts are another major problem because they weaken accountability and make it much harder to determine who performed a given action. Organizations also struggle when managers approve access automatically without understanding what is being requested, or when third-party users receive broad access without the same level of review applied to internal staff. For a beginner, these issues matter because they show that access control problems are often ordinary, not exotic. Weakness usually enters through routine decisions, delayed cleanup, informal exceptions, and poor review habits rather than through complicated technical failure alone. From an audit perspective, access control methods and evaluation are central because they reveal whether the organization is serious about limiting exposure to what people and systems genuinely need. An auditor may assess whether access policies are clear, whether roles and entitlements are reasonable, whether approval processes reflect real authority, whether privileged access is governed carefully, and whether periodic reviews actually detect inappropriate permissions. The auditor also wants to know whether the access control method chosen by the organization fits the environment it is meant to protect. A low-risk office file share may be governed differently from a system containing sensitive personal information or critical financial transactions, and that difference should make sense when examined. The main takeaway should feel clear. Access control methods determine how permissions are structured, and evaluation determines whether those structures work as intended in real life. For a new learner, this topic brings together identity, trust, privilege, accountability, and assurance in one practical area of control, showing how organizations protect information by making access deliberate, limited, reviewable, and aligned with real business need.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.